Hello and welcome friends. Today we are going to discuss the Industrial Industries Development and Regulation Act 1951. This will give you an idea of the close regulation that government exercised, the close regulation of the business affairs of the business firms that the government exercised in the first few decades after independence. So let's have a look at what were the provisions of this particular act. This is part of your syllabus, and the reason is that you should know about how the policies in India have evolved over the years. We have discussed MRTP Commission, we have discussed the Consumer Protection Act, we have also discussed how they now both of them they have been replaced by refurbished acts. So this is to give you an idea of the economic history of India and how the government policies and economic policies and regulatory environment has changed over the years as far as our country is concerned. Now, what are the provisions? The provisions, and I am going to take this up in very brief, so I am not going into details, I am not going to nitty-gritties of the law. I am just trying to give you an idea, an overview of what the law was, what was the objective, whether it was successful in achieving those objectives or not. So we'll do an appraisal also. So I'll give you just a brief idea. So the provision which were there in Industries Act 1951, they included this first statement that you see here, that government was given the authority to prescribe the net licensable capacity in each sector. What do we mean by this? First thing, government used to give away licenses. So for example, if you want to operate in a particular sector, let's say you want to produce spare parts for automobiles, supposing I'm giving you an example. So then first thing that you have to do is you have to apply to the government to obtain license, right? And when the government will give you license, the government will also specify what is the quantity that you can produce and sell. So the quantity that you can produce and sell used to be specified on the license, right? So the reason behind this was because we had limited amount of raw material at that point of time, right? Limited amount of raw material at that point of time, which meant if you want to purchase more raw material, you will have to spend your foreign exchange, because naturally you will be paying the firm from whom you are purchasing the raw material, you will be paying it in dollars. If you are purchasing it from outside, from some other country, naturally this would have meant that the government's foreign exchange would mean the foreign currencies that we have with us, that would reduce. At that point of time, we were not exporting too many commodities. So naturally, if we are importing too many commodities from outside and we are not exporting too many of them, naturally we'll have to pay more dollars to import those commodities. However, we'll earn less dollars or less foreign currency after exporting the commodities. So naturally there would be an imbalance and there would be a net forex outgo. Net forex outgo would mean net foreign exchange outgo. Basically, in totality, we'll have to spend our foreign exchange, and that would have caused so many issues. So the government came up with this particular idea that the total production capacity in all the sectors would be specified, and then accordingly it would be licensed to different firms in that particular sector. So the net licensable capacity in a particular sector means the net amount of output that can be generated in that particular sector. How much, what is the volume that can be generated, that can be produced in a particular sector. Now that was decided by the government for many of the sectors. So for many of the sectors, government decided as to what can be the maximum amount of production of this particular item. And once that had been determined, then the total capacity was allocated to firms, allocated to businesses on the first come first serve basis. What do we mean by this? The businesses which applied first were given the license first. I'll give you an example. Suppose I'm giving you a crude example. This is not at all using some figures from that period, but just to make you understand how the Industries Act worked and how this particular provision worked. Suppose in a particular sector, let's say I'm just giving an example. Let's say production of electric lamps or production of electric equipments, those equipments which run on electricity, right? So government supposing decided that only 100 units would be the licensable capacity, which meant that every year only 100 units of electric equipments will be produced, will be manufactured. Now this was the net licensable capacity in a particular sector, and then it was allocated to companies on first come first serve basis. For example, suppose a company, let's say P, comes and applies to the government. They want to set up a plant to manufacture the electric equipments, and they have to first of all come and apply to the government. So they apply for permission to produce 70 electric equipments, 70 units. So since they are the first one to have come for the permission, so they would be granted the permission to manufacture 70 electric equipments, 70 units. Now if a second company comes up, at most it could be given the permission to produce how many? 30, because we had decided that the total number of output units in a particular sector would be 100. So that we had decided. So the second company which comes in, since the 70 units have already been since the first company that turned up, P, has already been given the permission to produce 70 units, the second company which turns up and looks for permission and applies for permission, they can at most be given the permission to produce 30 units. So this was how the licensing regime worked at that point of time. Government first of all decided which sector, what should be the production level, because we had limited amount of raw material, so we had to allocate that raw material to different sectors of the economy, and that is what we did. So this was how it used to happen at that point of time. So this was the first provision of the Industrial Development and Regulation Act 1951. Now let us talk about the other provisions. And now we have understood that these licensable capacities were allocated to companies on the first come and first serve basis. First company which turns up will be given the permission to produce as much as it wanted. Then the second company will turn up. If some capacity is left, then it would be permitted to produce. Or if there is no capacity left, the first company has exhausted all the capacity, then second company would not get the opportunity, would not get the permission to produce anything. Is this understood? Now businesses were required to apply to the union government for license. So whenever a particular business has to be set up, it had to first of all go to the union government and apply for licenses. Be it setting up a new industrial undertaking, be it expanding capacity. So this was the kind of regulation which existed at that point of time. Even if you are setting up a new industrial unit, if you are trying to expand the capacity, if you are trying to produce more, you will have to first go to the government, seek their permission. And whenever the license was given, the union government was expected to lay down the conditions in the license. So all the conditions were laid down in the license. What do we mean by this? Have a look at this. What do we mean by this? All the conditions. For example, where would the manufacturing plant be set up? What would be the size of the undertaking? What would be the method of production? Everything was specified in the license. What would be the volume of production? Which channels would be used to then make the products available to the customers? So this is what we mean by the distribution channels. How was the product, the manufactured item, to be distributed to the customers? What particular channel was to be used? So even that had to be specified by the government. And then the selling price. So this was the kind of regulation which was there. All these aspects were to be decided by the government, and they had to be mentioned in the license that was given to the companies who had applied for that particular license. So everything was there in these kind of licenses. And in case, what if the business firms don't go by the conditions specified in the license? What if they don't abide by the conditions that have been given, that have been laid down in the license? What if they violate some of them? What if they don't use the same distribution channel as have been specified in the license? What if they sell the product at a price which is different from the one which is specified in the license? Then what will happen? The government had the authority under this particular act to take over the management of such undertakings. This is fine. So government could have simply taken over the management of such undertakings, right? There were exemptions, however, and we'll discuss these exemptions a little later. But now, since you know the provisions of this particular act, do you understand what was the basic objective behind coming up with this kind of act? The basic objective was that, see, we had limited amount of raw material, right, at that point of time, and I've already discussed this particular fact. Now, this had to be allocated to different sectors of the economy in a very, very intelligent fashion, because we could not have afforded only to produce electrical equipments and not to produce heavy equipments. We could not have afforded only to produce, let's say, luxury products or consumer durables like televisions or radios or fridges at that point of time. We had limited amount of raw material. Let's say if you talk about iron steel, there was limited supply of iron steel. There was limited supply of so many other types of raw materials that are required for production, and that is why they had to be allocated in a very, very careful manner, so that the demand of all the sectors of the economy, be it production of electrical items, be it production of heavy machinery, be it production of consumer durables, so all the sectors of the economy, they had to be satisfied. And that is why the government decided as to how much raw material will be allocated to which particular sector, and that basically led the government to fix the production volumes in a particular sector of the economy. So that was the whole objective behind this particular act. Is this okay now? And the whole rationale behind coming up with these kind of acts. Now let us talk about the exemptions which were there under this particular act. And you saw that you will see here that the exemptions were granted to those companies, those industries which were having less than 100 workers, and the fixed assets were less than rupees 10 lakhs. So these companies were granted exemptions from these kind of regulations under this particular act. However, this first thing that this tells you is that these kind of acts were basically meant for whom? They were basically meant for those companies which were having large scale operations, which were running large scale enterprises. That is number one. And secondly, it was basically focused on ensuring that the large scale firms do not misuse the financial muscle of theirs to corner all the resources. So that was the reason behind coming up with this particular exception. Now please understand, however, this exemption led to one big problem now. What was the problem? Sorry for this. See, since the exemption was granted to industries which were having less than 100 workers, the moment you have more than 100 workers, let's say the moment your employee strength becomes 101, what will happen? You will come under the purview of this particular act. You understand? And by the time, till the time you have number of workers less than 100, what will happen? You will not be covered by this particular act, and you would not be regulated by the provisions in this particular act. And if you don't want to be regulated, to be constricted by the provisions in this particular act, what will you do? You will not let your workforce, the number of total workers working in your organization, you would not let the strength of your workforce cross 100, because the moment it crosses 100, then you will have to go by the provisions in the act. So what would you do? Though you might require more number of workers, though your business might have expanded, you would still not hire more than 100 workers, because hiring more than 100 workers would mean coming under the purview of this particular act. So this was a perverse incentive to under-expand, not to expand as per your potential, as per your capacity. Many firms deliberately employed less than 100 workers, deliberately did not try and expand too much. They did not try to expand as much as their capacity permitted them, as much as their potential permitted them, just so that they can remain outside the purview of this particular act. Now this was a big problem with these exemptions which were granted, and please understand, even nowadays also these kind of things happen, right? So these kind of exemptions may ultimately not have the intended impact, and they may have some other impacts also. So they don't only have the intended impact, but they have some other impact also, right? Like the exemption here was meant so that the small companies don't have to worry about the provisions of this act. However, the actual impact was that the companies which could have grown bigger, which could have hired more than 100 workers, which could have grown their assets beyond rupees 10 lakhs, even they deliberately kept their expansion in check so that they do not have to come under the purview of this particular act, right? Now let us talk about the shortcomings in this particular act. And this act, basically, now you understand that it basically talked about industrial licensing. So what were the shortcomings? First shortcoming was that it was misused a lot by the big industrial houses. How? So these are some of the ways in which the big industrial houses misuse this particular act and the provisions of this particular act. Now you know that in a particular sector the total capacity was fixed. I've given you the example of, let's say, I've taken up one example. I've said that electrical equipment, suppose 100 units. This was decided by the government that only 100 units would be produced in this particular sector. What would the big industrial houses do? What they used to do? They would make multiple applications for the same product. So the same company, let's say Q, will make multiple applications. So it will make one application, the capacity in that particular application that it would ask for would be, let's say, 30. In the second application it was asked for 50, and in the third application it would ask for 20, right? And why would that company do that? Why that particular company did that? There was a reason behind that. By making multiple applications, now you are exhausting the whole licensable capacity in that particular sector. Only 100 items can be produced, and you have made 3 applications. In the first application, the capacity to produce 30 items was granted, in the second 50, and in the third 20. So basically, the only firm, Q was the only firm which actually made 3 different licenses, which requested for 3 different licenses. In the first, there was licensable, the production quantity that was requested was 30, in the second it was 50, and in the third it was 20. So basically the company now had exhausted all the possible licensable capacity in that particular sector. No other company could now be given the license to produce the same equipment. Why? Because only 100 items could have been produced, and in the 3 licenses that were requested by the first company Q, they had actually demanded 30, 50 and 20. The total is 100. So they had actually demanded that they be given the license to produce all the 100 units. So naturally there was no space left for any other company. So in that sense, what will happen? What would be the repercussion of this? What would be the result? The result would be that the company which made multiple applications and was granted license in 3 different applications to produce 30, 50 and 20 units, that company had actually exhausted all the licensable capacity in that particular sector, which meant that no other rival could have entered that particular sector. No other competition could have shared the spoils in that particular sector, could have come up and produced in that particular sector, because the first company, the Q company, has already exhausted all the licensable capacity. This was a very, very deliberate act on the part of these companies. Most of the big industrial houses indulge in these kind of practices. just to create a monopoly control, just to have a monopoly control of some particular sectors of the economy, and just to benefit by that monopoly control. Again, now naturally, our company Q that we have taken up in this particular example, they have made 3 different applications and they've been granted license to produce 100 different units. Many a times they simply didn't have the capacity to produce 100 units. So what would happen, let's say they only have the capacity to produce 60 units. So though they have the license to produce 100 units, they would only be producing 60 units. What will happen? 40 units would remain unproduced because they simply do not have the capacity to produce 40 more units. And what will it lead to? This will lead to a scarcity of electrical equipment in the market because the licensable capacity was 100 and out of that only 60 were produced. Q could not have produced more than 60, so they only produced 60. So there would be a net shortfall of 40. There would be a scarcity of 40 electrical equipment in the market. What will happen because of that? The prices would rise and ultimately it would be detrimental for the consumers. I hope now you also understand that Q, which made application, which applied 3 times, which made 3 applications, and they applied for a production capacity of 100 units. They were only able to produce 60 units. Why did they apply for 100 units? Do you understand the whole reason behind this? They applied for 100 units so that no other company could have entered that market. They didn't want other companies to enter that market, so they used to apply much beyond their actual capacity. Now this was a big problem and it led to entrenchment of monopolies in some sectors of the economy. So what was tried, what was expected to be stopped, the expansion of large scale firms into monopolies, that was what was expected to be stopped through this particular provision, industrial licensing provision of the IDR in 1951. This actually never happened. Again, maintaining permanent offices in Delhi to submit their application at the earliest. Now you remember, I hope you remember from the earlier discussion that the licenses were to be granted on first come first serve basis, right? So naturally the company that applies for the licenses first will be given the license. So what would they do? What would these big industrial houses do? They started having a permanent office in Delhi. So the moment they used to come to know that the government has opened up the process for submitting application for licenses, they would straight away submit their applications. And this way these big industrial houses cornered most of the licenses. The small firms, they simply did not have the resources to set up their offices in Delhi, to remain on alert throughout the day 24/7 for the government notification regarding the invitation for applications. So they simply could not have done that, and that is why they were mostly late in submitting applications for license, and that is what ultimately led to most of the licensing being cornered by the big industrial houses. So these were some of the lacunae in the act. And this could be seen that that monopolistic dominance of big industries could not be ended. What was the stated aim of this particular provision, this particular act? It actually was the act was not able to come up to that expectation, was not able to end the monopolistic dominance of different sectors of the economy. And this could be seen in the various figures that we have been able to come across. We have been able to have a look at 70 industrial houses. The large industrial houses accounted for majority of proposed private capital investments. So majority of licenses went to just 70 industrial houses. Small firms were, and they were numerous. So numerous small firms could only have half the share of the total licensable capacity. So most of the licenses were given away to the 70 large industrial houses. Again, and this was the reason why these firms, these industrial houses also received the majority of loans from the PSU banks. Again, another objective of this particular act was to achieve decentralized industrial development in different parts of the country, not concentrated in one particular state. However, this could not happen. You can see that majority of licenses went to only 4 industrial advanced states of Maharashtra, Gujarat, West Bengal and Tamil Nadu. So the majority went to these 4 states, and these 4 states were the ones which actually developed industrially. The other states lagged because the firms in those states were not able to obtain licenses. So industrial development was also lopsided in favor of these 4 states. Again, at times licenses were also issued for those sectors of economy which were reserved for the public sector. So private firms were given license for these kind of sectors: aluminium mining, fertilizer and machine tools, which were basically reserved for public sector at that point of time. You will be studying a little later when we will be discussing in Unit 5 about the economic systems. You will be studying about the Industrial Policy 1956 and Industrial Policy 1991. And Industrial Policy 1948 was also there. In 1948, some of the sectors were reserved for the public sector, and it was expected that no private investment would take place in those sectors. Only the government would invest. Government, public sector organizations, PSUs, public sector units would invest in those sectors. So some sectors were reserved. So these were the sectors which were reserved for only and only public sector, which means only and only government organizations, PSUs, were allowed to set up units in these sectors: aluminium mining, fertilizer and production of machine tools. However, licenses were issued to private firms also to produce these items, to manufacture these items. So this was again a problem with the industrial licensing of 1951. Again, licenses were also issued to foreign collaborations even in non-priority consumer goods. Now again we'll have to wait till we complete our discussion on 1956 industrial policy and 1948 industrial policy. It was said in the industrial policies of 1948 and 56 that foreign collaborations are allowed. Indian firm collaborating with foreign firm to set up a unit in India is allowed only in the priority sectors. Priority sectors were those sectors which were considered important for the economy of the country. Like so, for example, the arms and ammunition was a priority sector. It was very, very important for the domestic economy. Strategically also it was very, very important. So such sectors were earmarked as priority sectors, and it was said that in these sectors foreign collaborations would be allowed. Foreign firms would be able to set up units in collaboration with Indian firms here in India, and they would be allowed to set up units in these kind of industries. However, what happened was that license eventually were given to firms even in the non-priority industries also. Non-priority industries are consumer goods industries. See, consumer goods industries are not basic to our existence. They are not basic to our daily survival. So even in non-priority consumer goods industries were these licenses given. This is another shortcoming of the industrial licensing of 1951. For example, have a look at these non-priority consumer goods industries: camera and refrigerators. So these licenses were given here as well. Now this was again a problem with the industrial licensing of 1951. Now let us talk about the industrial policy of 1980. We'll be discussing the industrial policy of 1956 and 91 later on. So I'm talking about the industrial policy 1980 just to let you know that these licensing regime, which was first formulated with the implementation of the IDRA Act 1951, which we have just discussed, this licensing regime was later on liberalized in 1980. A number of industries which were requiring compulsory licenses was reduced to more than half. Earlier, more than 50 industries for 50 sectors of the economy were there which required licenses. So if companies have to set up their units in these 50 plus sectors of the economy, they had to first obtain a license. But then in 1980 this regime was liberalized. Now only 26 sectors were there in which if you want to set up a particular unit, you had to first obtain a license. So 24 plus sectors of the economy, they were now kept out of the purview of the act, kept out
of the purview of the act and kept out of the licensing requirement. So in the remaining sectors, no more there was any requirement for the firm to first obtain license before starting production. But that happened later on, almost 3 decades ago, almost 3 decades after the IDR in 1951. So it took a long time for the government to liberalize the licensing regime. Then broad banding was done. Broad banding is once licensing for broad category instead of a single product. Let's say I'll give you an example just to make you understand things. This does not correspond to the actual events, but I'm just giving an example. Let's say I am a company and I have got license to produce, let's say, steel castings, right? And steel castings of, let's say, 2 meter diameter. The diameter is 2 meter. So earlier the licenses were given product wise, specification wise. So for example, if I want to produce an item of 2 meter diameter, there would be a separate license. An item of 5 meter diameter, there would be a separate license. But now broad banding was done, which meant the same type of goods, for them the same licensing was there. What does this mean? This means that, for example, now if I want to produce castings, I don't have to obtain a license for a 2 meter casting and for a 5 meter casting a separate license. No, nothing like that. The same license which I would be given for the castings, the same license would be given, and I can make use of this license to either produce 2 meter or the 5 meter types. So I can use the same license to produce either of the types. So this was what was meant by broad banding. Earlier, for example, see, these examples have been given. For a particular fertilizers, let's say for potassic fertilizer, which have potassium, you were given license. For nitrogenous fertilizers, you had to take a different license. But this particular provision was ended, and now you had to take the license for the whole range of product. The licensing was broadband. Now you were not required to take a different license for a nitrogen fertilizer, a different license for the potassic fertilizer. Now you have to take the same license for the fertilizers, and you can have made use of the same fertilizer license to produce either the nitrogen fertilizer or the potassic fertilizer. Is this understood? Sorry for this. And capacity expansion was also allowed beyond the license capacity of 49% if you are undertaking some kind of a technology modernization, or if you are able to achieve scale economies. Technology modernization was, if the technology modernization is being undertaken, the company could have gone for capacity expansion, and the capacity expansion even 49% beyond license capacity. What it means, suppose you have been given the license to produce 100 items. Now you could have gone for 150 items, 149 items with the same license, if you are going for a modernization of technology, or if you are able to achieve scale economies. Scale economies is being able to produce at lower cost when you are producing in large amount. Is this okay? So why was this provision made? See, when you are modernizing your technology, you would certainly be able to produce more. Your efficiency would increase. You would be able to produce more with the same cost, with the same resources. Likewise, if you are able to have an economy of scale, you would be able to produce more with the use of same number of resources, same amount of resources. So naturally, in these cases, even if you are given a license of 100 and you have been able to modernize your technology, or you have achieved scale economies, you would be able to use the same resources to produce more than that. And that is why in these cases you would allow to make use of this modern technology and economy of scale to produce more than what the license specified, because in any case you were not using more resources. You were able to produce more without using more number of resources, and so this was allowed in the liberalized licensing regime that was installed in the year 1980. Okay, thank you very much for your time.